Let's get started. Okay. Well, this is a monstrous topic, just like every topic. And I don't pretend, once again, to be able to cover every little nuance and every little detail of it in the time we have, but I'll give you a couple of recommended books, recommended readings at the beginning, maybe if you want to go deeper. One of the books I really like is this book I like both of these books. There's many more. But the book on the right, Body, Soul, and Life Everlasting, by John Cooper, it came out a ways ago, but it's only like 2.99 on Kindle. So if you read Kindle, it's that's just as cheap as it can get. But if you like a hard copy, order a hard copy. N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, was one of the most monstrous books written on the resurrection that came out over the last 30 years. I got this as a birthday gift years ago when it came out, but that's a really good read too. There's many books on the topic, but I think those two will probably get you going. Now, notice how on the right side, the Body, Soul, and Life Everlasting book, notice how it says biblical anthropology and the monism dualism debate. So there's always been a debate, and there still is an ongoing debate among scholars about the anthropology of the Bible. Like what does the Bible teach about man? What are we? What is soul? What is spirit? What did the Jews believe? Because I mean, the Bible's written by Jews. It took place in a Jewish environment, of course, surrounded by Hellenism by the time of Jesus. And is it just teach everything's one? Like the Jews believed everything was one, or did they believe in some kind of dualism where um, the soul could separate from the body, or is that like a Greek invention or a Hellenistic invention? So these things have been debated for a long time. They're still being debated, but I think that we'll hopefully get a starting place tonight on this, and we can go deeper if we want to. But those would be a couple books I would recommend. Um, so, last I checked, the current life expectancy for United States of America in 2024 is about 79.4625 years of age. I don't know what it is in Canada or other parts of the world, but that's what it is in the United States. When I was growing up, my grandparents lived to the late 70s. They're gone now. And I thought that's probably when my parents will live to. I'd say like, well, they'll probably live to be the late 70s, and I'll probably live to be in my late 70s. And that's when most people die. That's what I always thought. Well, obviously, that's all shifted because many, many people, as you know, today are living way, way, way past that age. My dad is 95. He'll be 96 in April. There's a guy in his assisted living place that's 102. I have a friend of mine that just lost a family member who was 100. My mom made it to 85 or 86. She's gone, but people are living much, much longer these days, as we know. But that is the current life expectancy. So just from the statistics. Now we know that many people go throughout their lives trying not to think of the mortality issue. They don't try to think about the death question. Um, they may just try to stay busy. Obviously, the goal is to sometimes just keep doing, doing, doing. Don't slow down. Don't want to think about it. If they do think about it for a split second, they try to get busier because it depresses them. They're heavily distracted. We know that people have more things to be distracted about today than ever with the technology we have. You can keep yourself busy all day long looking at something on your phone or on your computer or just whatever. You can be entertained to death. But we know people generally can be distracted through just getting a lot of stuff and buying a lot of stuff and getting more and more. And we know that diversions are really helpful for them. Sometimes people want to get famous, maybe that'll take or just, be known, be seen and known, sometimes that's a diversion. There's all kinds of diversions out there, and Satan has been very crafty for a long time. He knows how to get people distracted, no doubt about it. And so he's doing a fabulous job today with all the technology we have today. I read the other day that 90% of teenagers are on TikTok. And they even admitted that the app The TikTok app is designed to be addictive. That's the way they designed it. They designed it so people will be addicted to it. So 95% of teens are on TikTok, a lot of college students as well. So that's not a good thing, but that's what's happening today. Okay. Now, when we think of our faith, we generally, I hope we all know, as I'll reiterate towards the end, that we believe the ultimate goal of the Christian life is resurrection. That's the ultimate end goal, is to be resurrected. Okay. We get a resurrected body. Jesus comes back to earth. The earth is redeemed. He's reigning on earth. We all have resurrected bodies. That's the end goal. That's coming. Okay. But for those of us that die before that period, which many people have, as you know, and people, and a good chance we will as well, is that, there's something that happens to us until we get that resurrected body, okay, where God transforms us physically, okay, because God cares about us holistically, cares about the whole person. So when Adam died in the garden, physical death entered into the world, as we know, and we physically die now, and spiritually die too. But what we're going to focus on tonight mostly? I've done other teachings on the resurrection. I certainly will mention it here, but mostly focusing on what we call the intermediate state. That word, that phrase is not in the Bible, but there's a lot of things we use in theology that aren't in the Bible, but the concept is. And we're talking about the state of being that exists from the time we die until we're resurrected. Like what happens to us in the go between, in the in between. Okay. That's what we're going to be focusing on tonight. Now, there's no doubt that many Christians generally believe in what's called the traditional view. I think the majority of Christians have believed for centuries that in some kind of intermediate state, we'll talk about the alternatives tonight, but they believe that when we die, something from us separates and goes on to be with God. Our physical body goes in the ground, in the casket, or cremated, whatever. I'm personally going to be in a casket. I don't want to be cremated. That's me. But the point is that's a whole topic for another time. But the point is that we believe something about us goes on. Okay, our soul goes on, our spirit goes on, or the real us goes on. We think that the body, some Christians even believe the body is just like a shell of us. The real us moves on. Okay. So that's a very common view with a lot of Christians. So what this view is called, it's what we call, another phrase for it or terminology we use is called temporary disembodiment. And this is where we believe the Bible teaches that we have an immaterial soul or spirit. And spirit and soul are sometimes used interchangeably in the Bible. Okay, we'll look at that more. But the point is that there's an immaterial soul or spirit that has a unity with our body. They're integrated together, right? They're not like fighting each other. I mean, there's an integration between them. But the immaterial soul or spirit can temporarily leave our body and go on and be conscious, await while we wait for the resurrection body in the final state. Okay, so there's a temporary detachment from our body. We go on in the form of our immaterial soul or spirit to be with God. Okay, that's another way of kind of talking about the intermediate state. Now, this means that most Christians throughout the centuries, from all different backgrounds, whatever, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Protestant, evangelical, whatever, have all believed generally in some kind of dualism. And what that means is that the soul is an immaterial thing that's different from our body and brain. Okay, so we might want to say like our core personalities, whether we label them souls or spirits or persons or cells or egos, are distinct and from our body. Okay, and they can exist beyond our physical bodies after death. Now, like I said, there's an integration, the way God's designed it, between the soul and the body, where it's not that they're like all fragmented and cut up. It's just that God made us as integrated beings. There's a definitely a relationship between those entities. Okay. And like if you think about it, when you think of the transgender movement today, problem they have, the reason they're getting that all wrong is because they say the real them, the real inner me is overriding my body. It's like more important than my body, than my biology. So they're saying my psychology, the real me deep down says I'm a female, but my biology says I'm a male. So they split those two, completely opposed to each other, and make them, distinct between each, kind of somewhat opposite of each other, make them apart from each other in a way that there's no integration anymore. They basically let their mind rule over their body. Whereas in Christianity, we've always tried to keep those together. It's true that we believe the soul can separate from our body temporarily, but they're not like at war with each other, and we don't, place one is over the other. Okay. So, but in transgenderism ideology today, it's what they do. You go and you get evaluated, and they say, well, my psychology tells me I'm in the wrong body. So therefore, I'm going to let my what they're telling people to do is let their psychology rule. Say, okay, if your inner you, the real you, tells you you're a female, but you're biologically male, let's go get ahead and get transgender surgery. And that's where they're going wrong, and that's why they're going to pay the price dearly. And they are paying the price right now. A lot of detransitioners, a lot of problems. Okay. But that's a topic for another time. So in within dualism, there's always been different kinds of dualism. There's one way or the other. They're somewhat similar in some ways, but there's a little distinction. There's a thing called Cartesian dualism. There's something called substance dualism. There's a thing called Thomistic dualism, which is based after Thomas Aquinas. And then there's what we call holistic dualism. I kind of endorse what we call holistic dualism. I tend to favor the work of John Cooper. That's the guy I showed you at the beginning, that book right here. Back here, that's what he favors, some kind of holistic dualism, meaning that the body and the soul, everything, there's a holism between them. Okay, there's an integration. Okay, but it still believes that something about us can separate from our body temporarily. Okay, that can happen. Okay, it's possible. All right, now let's look about a little bit about death in the Bible. The Old Testament certainly doesn't say a tremendous about the afterlife. You have such idioms that associate death. When in Israel's history, I'm referring to the Jews, when someone died, you were gathered to your people. They placed each other in the same tomb. Of course, you see this in Jesus's time as well, where they found that all those ossuaries where the bones of the victims are all buried in the same family tomb, right? They found the families together in ossuary. But the point is, you could be viewed as like sleeping or resting with your ancestors, right? If you read the Old Testament, you'll see that happen with like Abraham and Jacob. They're taken to where the rest of the family is, and they're put in the same place. So that's associated with death. It's not obviously it's more than cessation of physiological processes, just like a physical death. I mean, we see that obviously you see passages where the body returns to the dust and the spirit goes back to God. You see that Ecclesiastes 12:7 and Genesis 2:7. And so that is seen. And we know that biblically, that in the garden in Genesis, that people, when God created us, he created us for life, not death. Okay. He created us. The goal is to live. Death entered the world through Adam and the fall of the garden, as we know, the fall. That's where death entered into the world, and that's not what God wanted, but now it's here. So now we all die physically, our bodies break down, we get sick. There's all kinds of physical problems, as we know. Some of us have suffered from those, I know. And we spiritually die as well. Okay, we face physical and spiritual death. But that's not what God wanted in the beginning. We know also our days are numbered. It talks about in Psalm 90:10, we can't take any day for granted. Our days are all numbered. I don't have any idea how long each of us are going to live. None of us knows. But the point is, the Bible says life is like a vapors, in the book of James, and then we're gone. Okay. Now, some of the words that cover the word soul in the Old Testament. Of course, that's nephesh. I'm sure maybe some of us familiar with that. That's the Hebrew word for soul. It occurs 755 times in the Old Testament. Sometimes it means life, right? It's synonymous with life. Life, it's 117 times you'll see the use. Um, it's not really referred to as is an immortal soul, but really like the life principle or living being. Okay. Um, we know even animals are rendered living creatures, like they have a nephesh as well. Now, I don't want to get into whether animals go to heaven or any of that stuff. That's not what I'm talking about tonight. But the point is that the same words used for them. Okay. It's also seen in Genesis 2:7, right? Where like the dust is vitalized by the breath of God and becomes a living being. So we share a soul with animals, but of course it's the breath of God that makes the lifeless dust in Genesis a living being, a person, right? Okay. Um, Nefesh can also refer to a body part. Sometimes it can refer to the throat or the neck. It can be used to refer to a dead animal corpse or dead human corpse. I'm sorry. And sometimes a desire. Sometimes it refers to life itself, like when Leviticus 17:11 says the life is the nephesh of the flesh is in the blood, right? That's life, the word nephesh, right? So it's like the life vital principle, okay, that makes something animated or alive, right? And it has to do with our personal identity because there's passages where you'll see in the Old Testament where our the life of man goes on. It talks about in the disembodied state. I don't know. I'll mention a few of these passages shortly. Okay. We know that like when Rachel dies, Genesis 35:18, some of the translations says her soul was departing, her nephesh was departing. You could say her life was departing, right? Um, Isaiah 53:12, when it talks about the suffering servant, Isaiah predicts the servant of the Lord would pour out his soul or his nephesh to death, right? Um, so there's all kinds of passages that talk about the nephesh or the soul or the life. Okay, no doubt about it. And then you have the word for Hebrews ruach, the spirit. Okay, in the New Testament it's pneuma, but the ruach of course refers to the wind or the moving air. Um, Sometimes associated, of course, with the breath of God or the breath, spirit of God. Of course, if you read Ezekiel 37, it talks about the vision of the dry bones. God breathes his spirit into them, right? His ruach. And of course, we know that we're all indwelt by the ruach, right? When we come to know the Lord, the ruach comes up. He comes into our lives and takes resident in our lives. We're led by the ruach hakodesh or the Holy Spirit, right? Now, this is important because whenever you study any kind of doctrine in the Bible, whether it be the afterlife, the Trinity, Jesus' deity, Israel, the role of Israel, the role of the church, or um, anything, really, the law, the role of the Torah, the law, anything. The advice I would give is always start reading the Bible left to right. You want to start in the Old Testament and then read on your way into the New Testament. In other words, when you study it, go left to right. Don't start with the New Testament, okay? Because then you're going to miss how God progressively revealed something over history, okay? Because that's what he does. He reveals things progressively. He doesn't reveal it all at once. He gives us sometimes little hints of things in the Old Testament, then they become more understandable in the New Testament, right? Like the Trinity is talked about a little bit in the Old Testament. There's some hints of it, but it's much more explicit in the New Testament. That's the way it is. So, but a lot of times Christians, what they do is they just read the New Testament and they think, well, that's all I need to read. But remember, Jesus and Paul were raised on the Old Testament. There was no New Testament at their time, nor for the apostles. Okay, they're all raised on the Old Testament. Okay, so that's where we want to understand. That's how we learn something. Okay, hopefully you'll take that approach as we're doing tonight. Now, when people die in the Old Testament, there's a word that's called Sheol, and this is what they believed happened to the dead. It's called the place of the dead, or what we call the place of the departed souls or spirits. Now, If you look at some of the passages, of course, you could just look this up in the Old Testament. There's all kinds of passages that mention this, right? But you'll see that in some cases, um, life is depicted there as sometimes lethargic, inactive. It's almost kind of like an unconscious coma in a way. But then there's other passages that seem to indicate that people seem to be awake and active. It's like both and. But this is what most of the Jews believed happened to you when you die. Now, it is true that um, it does seem that Sheol in the Old Testament is where everybody goes after death. Okay, it's where the righteous and the wicked both go. It isn't hell. It's a synonym for death. But definitely, this is where the Old Testament teaches that everybody goes. Okay, I'll give a few passages here, like Genesis 37:35. These are proof texts. I don't have time to read the whole chapter in context, but that's what you should do. It says here, then all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. He said, surely I'll go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. So there's someone, he's stating that, I'm going to go down there to Sheol. He's not like, oh, I got to go there. I mean, he seems to know that's where he's going. Proverbs 1:12, let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. Sometimes Sheol is referred to as the pit as well. There's another one, Isaiah 38:18. It says, for Sheol cannot thank you, death cannot praise you, those who go down the pit cannot hope for your faithfulness. Okay? It is true that most of the passages that refer to this, there's not a lot of thanksgiving going on there. Okay? No doubt about that. Now, just remember that I'm just going to skip that right now. So I'll go back to that. But you think about people, is this like our actual, these people, is this like their soul, their nephesh and Sheol? Is that what's going on there? It seems that you see something that they're kind of referred to like a shade or something, or like a Raphim, Raphaim, that just, it's not really clear exactly what they look like. Okay, there's something there, of course, but there's a guy named George Allen Ladd. He lived a long time ago, read a lot of theology books. He was a New Testament scholar, but he taught at Fuller Seminary, and he says it's some kind of pale replica of man himself, whatever it is, the shade or whatever it is. There's something there, whether it's a full-blown immaterial soul, it's a little vague. Okay. But we have an incident that happens that's just very weird. It's one of those weird passages in the Bible. The Bible's from the modern standpoint, you read the Bible, it sounds weird sometimes, right? And you have that incident where the witch of Endor summoned Samuel from the dead. If you know the story, King Saul came to the witch. He wanted to bring Samuel up from the dead, which was a mistake. Samuel was in big trouble. I mean, Saul was in big trouble, and we know he went about handling it the wrong way. And we know that the Torah is totally against doing this, right? Consulting mediums or anything like this. You're not supposed to go consult the spirits of the dead. No divination at all, but Saul is an idiot, and we know that this is what he does. And then the witch, he finds this witch to try to bring up Samuel from the dead. And we know that something is seen here. We know the witch freaks out, screams. We know that whatever it is, whatever Samuel is, it's some sort of, it's something, it's a visual appearance of Samuel. It doesn't seem to be like a ghost. Maybe it's a ghost or something like that, or a shade. I mean, you know what I mean by ghost, like it's some sort of spiritual being, but it doesn't appear to be like an immaterial soul, because he's very recognizable in some way. And he also speaks with a voice that can be heard. Okay. And we also know that there's also questions about this passage. For years, people have asked, is it Samuel that truly appeared, or was this an illusion perpetrated by the witch, or was it a demonic deception? We know that the medium, the witch, screams when she sees Samuel. She seems to be surprised. She's not like, I knew you're coming up from the dead. We've been waiting for you. She seems to kind of scream. We know the spirit rising from the earth is called Samuel, and we know that the text does not say that the spirit appeared to be Samuel or that the medium thought it was Samuel. The text refers to the spirit as Samuel. And we know that the spirit spoke the truth because the message that Saul receives happens, right? It comes to pass. So if that's the case, there's something there that shows that there's some sort of life after death going on. And it definitely would shoot down any case that the Jews didn't have any framework for that in any way. But this is certainly one of the weirder passages in the Old Testament, but it's certainly something to think about for sure. Now, there's another passage in 1 Kings 17:19-23. I don't know if you remember this. When they come to Elijah and you have the dead son, and Elijah takes the son and he took him from the woman's arms, and then he carries him to the upper room where he's saying he laid him on his bed. And then Elijah cries out to God. He says, Lord, my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I'm staying with by causing your son to die? That he stretches himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, Lord, my God, let this boy's life return to him. Now, remember, the word life is nephesh, right? That's the word nephesh, soul or nephesh. And then it says the Lord heard Elijah's cry and the boy's life returned to him and he lived. Okay. So apparently there's a case where the boy's nephesh left and it came back. Okay. So that's another case for some sort of disembodiment. Okay. So that's kind of interesting. By the way, that's also a case for resurrection, but not the same kind of resurrection that happened to Jesus. Okay. Because Jesus is the only one who came back from the dead and lived and goes on to live forever and ever and ever, right? He's the only one that's ever done that. Everyone else in the Old Testament, including Lazarus, the New Testament, they go on to die again, right? Not the same with Jesus. Okay, so let's think about this. If the righteous and the unrighteous were in Sheol, I talked about both the righteous and the unrighteous go to Sheol. What happened to the righteous? I mean, did they just stay there permanently? Well, we need to remember, of course, the word Hades. This is the word that's equivalent to Sheol in the Greek. Okay, this is the same thing, like the place for the dead. That's the word that's equivalent of Sheol. But if you read, it's going to have a lot to do somewhat with what you believe about Luke 16. Okay, because in that reading there in Luke 16, where it talks about Abraham's bosom, it talks about how Hades seems to be divided into 2 realms. You have a place of comfort where Lazarus was, that's Abraham's bosom. And then you have the place of the torment where the rich man was. Okay. And then you have Lazarus's place, which is like elsewhere called paradise, Luke 23:43. But if you look at that diagram there, what that would mean is that people are temporarily right now in Sheol or Hades. That's where the people who are waiting the final judgment, hell, because nobody's in hell right now. They would be there right now. They'd be over in Sheol or Hades. They're both the same, just different words, right? And then the other people would be in paradise right now, or sometimes as a synonym for heaven. Now, some people think paradise and heaven are not the exact same. Some people think they go to paradise first, then heaven. I don't really know. All I know is that they're not in Sheol or Hades. Okay. And so that would be the 2 kind of dividing places where people are right now, waiting the final resurrection. Okay, until when Jesus resurrects us all, or in a temporary state. Because the end of Revelation, we know there's another judgment, and then people will be going to hell permanently, or to be resurrected to life permanently. I mean, I'm talking about there's even a better a greater judgment that comes later on, and we're even in better shape because then we get a resurrected body in the new heavens and the new earth. But the people that don't believe in Yeshua and are judged obviously are not there. Okay. Now, I don't really know. Like some people say, like Luke 16 is a parable, but it never says it's a parable, by the way. It doesn't say that. But some people don't think it's literal, it's symbolic. There's some debate about that. We know that I mean, Jesus refers to Lazarus and as a real person, mentions a real person. I don't think it really matters that much, to be honest, because I think the importance sometimes, of course, parables do point to a literal truth, even though in the parables, of course, they're not like literal things. When it talks about like the parable of the fig tree or the parable of the sower and those things, those are presenting spiritual truths, but they point to certainly a reality, right? Something that's realistic. So I do believe that there's some sort of true incident or spiritual truth that comes out of that is based on reality, of course. Okay. Um, Now, like I said, some people think paradise is synonymous with heaven. Um, you talk about the thief on the cross. Jesus says, today with me, you'll be in paradise instantly. I think we all know that story right there, that teaching in Luke 23. Um, that's generally what a lot of people believe. It's synonymous, the same thing. Paradise is used 3 times in the New Testament in Revelation 2:7. It refers to the restoration of Eden. It also in 2 Corinthians 12:4, we know that Paul says he was taken up into third heaven, the place which God dwells. Um, that's kind of like paradise as well. But anyway, one way or the other, it's all good, I think. Okay, whether it's paradise or heaven. Biblically, there's 3 heavens. The first is the sky, by the way, above us. The second one's the stars, and the third one's the very abode of God, called the third heaven or paradise, by the way. So that's what I think we're thinking of, number 3. Okay. Now, let's look at some things that support more of an intermediate kind of conscious existence between death and resurrection, where it teaches that we are fully conscious of when we die. We know where we are. We know what's happening. Okay. Versus like soul sleep, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I think for most of us, when we go to funerals, we lose loved ones, we think about our own lives. I think that we think that generally, most of us, when we die, we enter into a different dimension. Heaven is a different dimension. I don't know how fast we go there in an instant. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know where it is. We can't, go visit it necessarily. Of course, there's been near-death experiences, which I'll mention. But the point is that I think we like to take comfort in the fact that we will be just changing destinations very quickly, and we will be in a much better place than this, and we will be aware of where we are. We'll be conscientious of where we are, and we will understand it. Okay, maybe not understand it completely, but we are aware. Okay, we have consciousness there. We do have conscious activity there. There are some passages, that talk about this in the New Testament. One to think about is the Matthew 17 text, where Jesus is on the Mount of Transfiguration, and then Moses, Elijah are seen there, and they're able to talk with Jesus. The disciples see them, and they seem to be visible in some way. I don't know what it is. I don't know if they're in some sort of temporary body. I don't know if it's like their soul is like, it's their soul, and they're able to be seen in a way that's recognizable. I don't know. But the point is that something is that they're there and they're recognizable. Okay, so that would mean that this is in a intermediate state of some kind. Okay, I would assume it is, unless God just suddenly, did something else with them temporarily. But that's generally what I would take away from it. There's another passage in Revelation 6:9-10 where you see the souls of the martyred saints in heaven. Okay, during which they have not received their resurrection bodies, but they cry out to God for judgment for those on earth. Now, the only challenge with that passage is that the book of Revelation is apocalyptic literature. You've got a lot of symbolism, and sometimes it's hard to differentiate between what's literal and what's symbolic, because there's an awful lot of symbolism in the book of Revelation. Not everything is literal, of course. I don't think there's like a literal dragon. The dragon's a symbol and represents something, but it's not like a literal God breathing. It's not a literal breathing dragon like you see in like the Lord of the Rings or something, right? So there's a lot of symbolism in the book of Revelation. So I'm not sure, but that's a passage there. There's another passage in 2 Corinthians 5:8 where Paul, of course, talks about being absent from the body and present with the Lord. He says, like, it's like a nakedness. So, because he knows that the Jews do not believe, they don't believe temporary disembodiment is the ultimate goal. As Jews, they believe in resurrection. That's the goal. Okay, so the goal is not just to experience this temporary, but you're naked in a sense because you don't have your resurrected body. That's what he's talking about there. Okay, that's what he's looking forward to, especially if you read 1 Corinthians 15. And then we know, of course, again, the Luke passage where Jesus talks about today you'll be with me in paradise. Now, there's a couple more. There's that one in 1 Peter 3:18-20, where Christ, it says, Jesus was made alive in the spirit, and he went and made proclamation to the spirits who are now in prison. And we know that there's a lot of debate about, what those spirits are, whether they're demonic or whether they're spirits from the time of Noah or whatever they are. But the point is that Jesus seems to exist outside his body for 3 days. He's doing something without a body, as we know, because he was resurrected 3 days later. Okay, so Jesus obviously was disembodied. Okay, so that's something you just need to remember, that our own Lord was disembodied for a few days. Okay, without a body, and he went and did that. Okay, didn't do it in his earthly body, didn't do it in his resurrection body. His body was in the tomb, right, and then was resurrected 3 days later. We also know in the passage I mentioned, 2 Corinthians 12-4, that Paul talks about that visionary experience he had 14 years later. He says he doesn't know whether he was in his body or whether he was in a state of temporary disembodiment. Okay, and so the point is that he thought something had gone out of there'd been some sort of temporary disembodiment, even though he wasn't sure how to describe it. Okay, something happened there. Now, it's important to understand that that Jesus had a lot more in common with the Pharisees than we think he did, even though he rebuked them a lot. Some of us think that he had nothing in common with them, but he did. He had way more in common with them about the afterlife than the Sadducees, right? We know he rebukes the Sadducees. We know he says God is the God of the living, right? The God of the living, not the dead, and the God of the living and the dead. But the point is that he and Paul, of course, was a Pharisee. We know that he said that several times, that they had more in common with the Pharisees about the afterlife. Okay, the Pharisees believed in resurrection, and we also see that they also believed in intermediate state. They believed that you could have temporary disembodiment. Okay, where like I've been talking about, the Pharisees actually believe that. There are passages that if you read all throughout the intertestamental period, that's the time between the Old and New Testament, that literature that was written then, that you'll see that there's passages refer to souls or spirits, okay, that are disembodied, okay, and they're active in the intermediate state. So the Pharisees, Jesus, and Paul all believed resurrection was the reunion of the soul and the body in a transformed body. Okay, they might, there might have been some details, the precise nature of the resurrection body, but the Pharisees and Jesus, Paul, all believed in resurrection as well as temporary disembodiment. Look what Josephus says about the Pharisees right here. This is Josephus. He was the greatest Jewish historians who wrote about the Second Temple period where Jesus and Paul were. He said, and the Pharisees were as well. He says they believe the souls, this is in Josephus's works, the New Complete Light works of Josephus. You should get that. It's by Paul Meyer. He says there, they believe the souls have the power to survive death, and their rewards and punishments, under the earth for those who have led lives of virtue and vice. Eternal punishment is the lot of evil souls, while the good souls receive an easy passage to a new life. They also says every soul they maintain is imperishable, but the soul the good alone passes into another body. The souls of the wicked suffer eternal punishment. So that's going to be closer to what Jesus and Paul believed as well, like I said, with the Pharisees. Now, maybe not exactly precisely, but pretty close, okay? Now, let me mention, let me skip ahead here, sorry. There's a guy named Maimonides that came along a lot later in Jewish thinking, much later in history. And he was one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of all time. Most Jews still read his works to this day. He actually totally transformed Judaism, and a lot of Jews believe what they believe because of Maimonides. So he comes along in like the medieval period, and he even said, look what he said, the body and the soul will be reunited once again after they've been separated by death, and it cannot be interpreted other than literally. For we must understand that even though many other biblical verses may be interpreted allegorically, this must be taken literally. So that's kind of interesting, kind of supporting the view of the Pharisees and Jesus and Paul. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, so let me mention something about soul sleep, because some people believe in this. Jehovah Witnesses believe in soul sleep. Seventh-day Adventists believe in soul sleep, and even some Christians believe in soul sleep, different denominations. Soul sleep says that what happens is at death, we're just simply we go to sleep. We're not conscious of where the soul sleeps, literally, that we have no awareness of where we are. We're not conscious between death and resurrection. It's not that we're experiencing something bad. It's not that we're experiencing something good. We're just asleep. Literally, our soul is asleep until the final judgment. And then we'll be awakened to resurrection, to everlasting life or everlasting judgment. Okay, so death is temporary, but the resurrection, will come later on. Now, there are some passages in the Bible that it seems like it teaches people being asleep. We know that. In Daniel 12:2, right? It talks about the resurrection will be, the resurrection happens. It talks about multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, right? They were asleep and then they awaken in the resurrection. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15:6, those who have fallen asleep. Luke talks about the death of Stephen. When Stephen died in the book of Acts, remember he was martyred. He said he fell asleep. Remember in John chapter 11, when Jesus is about to heal Lazarus, and Jesus says he's asleep, right? Refers him as being asleep. Same with Jairus' daughter. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, talks about those who had died before Jesus' return, that they are asleep, says they've fallen asleep. So obviously, sleep is a metaphor for death, no doubt about it. Sleep is definitely a metaphor for death in the Bible, okay? But the question is, let me mention something else. There's a couple passages also in intertestamental period. This is the time between the Old and New Testament, that there are passages that seem to teach the same thing. Similar as the biblical passages I just read, like in 1 Enoch 91:10. It says, then the righteous one shall rise from his sleep, and the wise one shall rise, and he shall be given unto him, and through him the roots of oppression shall be cut off, sinners shall be cut off. And then it says in 1 Enoch 92:2, the righteous one shall waken from his sleep. He shall arise and walk in the ways of the righteous. Okay? So it sounds like, maybe that's teaching soul sleep, but it's not teaching soul sleep, because what it's teaching is the body's asleep. Okay? The body is what's resurrected, and the body is what's asleep. Okay? So when you see those passages about asleep, it's referring to the body, not the soul. Obviously, like I said, the sleep is a metaphor for sleep. The sleep is a metaphor for death. I mean, when they're dead, they're sleeping. But the soul does not sleep, as far as we can tell, as far as some of the other passages we looked at. It's more referring to the body that sleeps. Okay. The two resurrections that occur in Daniel, or just in general, are we see the contrast. Those who are asleep will be awakened and be physically resurrected to either they'll be transformed, or they'll be changed, or they'll be unchanged. They'll ever be resurrected to everlasting life, if you see on the one chart on the one side, or they'll be resurrected to shame and everlasting contempt. You can see the contrast, where we will have as a resurrected body, imperishable body, a redeemed body, a transformed body, dominated by the Holy Spirit, animated. And then you have the other ones that are going to perish. Okay, it's a dishonorable body, and they will be judged. Okay. You never notice that Daniel 12, if you ever read that, it sounds a lot like what Jesus says in John 5. When Jesus says, "Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming in which all who are in the tomb shall hear his voice, and shall come forth those who did good deeds to resurrection of life, and those who committed evil deeds to resurrection to judgment." Okay, very similar to what Daniel 12 teaches right there. Now, the goal, of course, like I said, is that we get resurrected and receive our new resurrected bodies in the new heavens and the new earth. Jesus will come back and he will set up his kingdom here, and there will be a new earth come, and we'll have a resurrection body. So that is the end game. So if you think about when we present the gospel to somebody, when you share the gospel, the good news with somebody, it's kind of like a triple whammy. They get a relationship with God in this life, they get eternal life starting now, carries on when they die, right? They have new life when they die, and then eventually they get a new resurrected body and get to be in the new heavens, new earth. So it's like a triple whammy, right? Just like the opposite. If they don't know the Lord, they're separated from God right now on this earth. They continue to be separated from him after they die, and they will be separated him in the new heavens and new earth as well, to be resurrected to everlasting judgment. So it goes three ways on both sides, triple whammy. Okay, I also want to mention that if you guys remember, some of you were here for a long time ago, I did some interviews on my Zoom calls with this gentleman here, Stephen Miller. If you go to his website, he's got a lot of resources there, but he's done a lot of documentation on near-death experiences. And there is a fair amount of evidence for near-death experiences. Now, some of you may know people have had them. There's been books written about them. Some of them are not, some of them are a little questionable, but other ones are legit. But there's these near-death experiences happen all across all cultures, all across the world, where someone seems to be clinically dead, but yet they seem to separate from their body temporarily. And then they're able to recall things that were going on while they're clinically dead. Like if the person's in the hospital and they separate from their body, they're able to recall names and people and conversations when they come back. And the doctor's dumbfounded, like how they knew. And they said, "Oh, I heard the whole thing. I saw the whole thing. I was in the room above you all looking at you talking." So, there's a lot of documentation on that, a lot of scientific peer-reviewed research. So I recommend that book. That's just a good starting point. He's got some other resources. But that's a good piece of evidence that we can temporarily separate from our bodies. Okay, if that's the case. Now, like I said, I know there's a lot of skepticism about this. There's been a lot of criticism, but there's been a lot of responses from the criticism. There's been a lot more scholarship on it, but there are some really good documented cases about near-death experiences. So I encourage you to get Stephen's book. He's got another book out. I think he's got two out now. There's other books on the topic, but just check it out. Something worth looking at. Now, I also want to mention that when you think of hell, that I think a lot of times people have the picture comes up with their mind of Dante's Inferno. That's just a common cultural way of thinking of something. We do this with pictures all the time, just like we have pictures of Jesus. These pictures don't even look like him. We don't know what he looked like, but the point is, a lot of people get these images in their minds, and that's unfortunate because we really, that just sticks in people's minds wherever you go. Sometimes that's what they picture, just like the heaven, the guy floating around in the clouds, right? That's kind of what happens in heaven. But remember that hell is just a translation from the word Gehenna, and that wasn't like they went around and said the word hell, right? It's just a translation. But it comes from this place in Israel. If you've been to Israel, I've seen it. Some of you have been to Israel, you've seen this. This valley right here, you drive right by it on the tour bus and you see it. I didn't go down there. I know you can go down there, but this is the location of a location where there was Canaanite worship and Canaanite sacrifice, um, where children were sacrificed. The Canaanite gods are sacrificed children to their gods Molech. And unfortunately, God warned Israel, the Jews, not to participate in that, and they ended up mixing that in their own faith. And unfortunately, they were impacted by the Canaanite idolatry. And Jeremiah ended up prophesizing that God would judge them severely for it. And it happened in this area right here. And so this area has a depiction, like when Jews heard of it, they think of judgment. They think of God judging severely Israelites' idolatry. Okay. And this was exactly what would come to their minds when Jesus would talk about hell. Jesus says, there's 11 times in the Gospels he mentions that word, Gehenna. He talks about, anyone who says you fool be in danger of the fire of Gehenna. He says it in Matthew 18, 8-9. Better you to enter life maimed or crippled, have an eye, than have one eye and two eyes, or be thrown into the fire of Gehenna. He uses Gehenna a lot. And, whether the fire and the flames in the passages are literal or metaphorical, I don't know. I mean, sometimes it's, people think they're used to depict how horrific it'll be. Most theologians don't think they're literal, but it doesn't matter because it points to a literal truth that hell is literal. It is a real place that is misery. I don't think it matters at the end of the day. It's not a place that you want to be. It's divorce from God, separation from God permanently. It's a permanent divorce. But anyway, so just a little thing about hell there. Just want to mention that. Okay. So that's about all I have. I know that was a lot for an hour, but if you know the Lord, I think there's good evidence that you will be consciously aware of where you are when you die, and then you'll be resurrected. Of course, in the new heavens, the new earth, you'll be resurrected. You'll have a resurrected body. I don't know exactly what we look like in heaven. Some people think we get a temporary body there. There is some arguments that say we get some sort of body there in some way, not a resurrection body, but maybe we have some body there of some kind so we can recognize each other. There's some evidence for that, but then some people say they're not sure. So one way or the other, I know it's all good one way or the other. If we don't know what exactly it's going to look like, we're going to look like there. All I know is that it'll be the restoration of all things. And that means whatever you're lacking now, it'll be restored, including hair. Right, Larry? Okay. So let's